I got home from work, tired but glad to be back. The truck rumbled into the driveway, and I grabbed my bag, heading inside. Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, the usual smell of dinner filling the air. The house felt normal, the TV on low, and I dropped my keys on the table. My job at the warehouse kept me busy, but this was my routine, home to her and Max. The kitchen was warm, her humming steady, and I said, "Hey, good day." She smiled. "Yeah, same as always," and kept working. I checked on Max. He was in the living room, 7 years old, playing with toy cars on the floor. The house was quiet, his laughter soft, and I sat with him. We've been close for years. I'm not his dad, but he calls me that sometimes. The kitchen clattered with pots. Sarah busy, and I ruffled his hair. My warehouse job was done. Tom covered the night shift, and I relaxed. The living room had his drawings on the wall, bright colors, and I felt at home. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I watched him play. We talked a bit. I said, "How's school?" And he nodded. "Fine, we drew today." The house was warm, the fridge humming, and I grabbed a soda. Sarah called, "Dinner soon?" And I yelled back, "Great." Max pushed a car, making engine noises, and I smiled. He's a good kid. My warehouse job paid the bills, but this was my break. The living room was messy, toys everywhere, and I helped him line them up. The kitchen smelled of soup, her voice steady, and I felt normal. The truck waited the night early, and I stayed with him. I thought about our life. Sarah and I have been together 5 years, living as a family with Max. The house was ours, the mortgage mine, and I worked hard. The living room had our couch picked together, and I sat on it. My warehouse job was steady. Tom and I managed orders, and I felt settled. She came in, wiping her hands, and said, "He's been good today." The kitchen was busy, the soup simmering, and I nodded, "Good to hear." The truck sat outside, the driveway quiet, and I watched Max race his cars. We played together. I grabbed paper and crayons, and we started drawing. The house was warm, his focus on truck, and I sketched a house. Sarah yelled 5 minutes, and I said, "Okay." My warehouse job faded. Tom handled the late shift, and I enjoyed this. The living room was bright, his laughter loud, and I drew a tree. The kitchen clanked with dishes, her voice calling, and I felt close to him. The truck was parked, the night calm, and I stayed with Max. The house was home, our routine solid, and I relaxed. I helped with dinner. Sarah set the table, and I carried plates, the soup ready. The house smelled good, the table full, and Max ran in. My warehouse job was over. Tom texted, "All clear," and I ignored it. She said, "Sit," and I did. Max next to me. The living room was quiet, the toys put away, and I served him soup. The kitchen was warm, her smile normal, and I ate. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I felt at ease. The house was ours, the night routine, and I stayed calm. I thought about work. The warehouse was busy, orders piling up, but Tom managed. The house was quiet, dinner done, and I cleared plates. Sarah washed up, humming, and I dried. My warehouse job paid fine, but this was my life. The living room had the TV on, a kid show, and Max watched. The kitchen was clean, her voice soft, and I stacked dishes. The truck waited the night early, and I felt tired but good. The house was home, our family set, and I sat with them. We watched TV. Max climbed onto the couch, and I let him. The show loud. The house was warm, the lights dim, and Sarah joined us. My warehouse job was done, Tom covered, and I relaxed. She said, "Long day?" And I nodded, "Yeah." The living room was cozy, his head on my shoulder, and I smiled. The kitchen was quiet, the soup gone, and I felt close. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I stayed put. The house was ours, the night calm, and I enjoyed the moment. I planned the evening. After the show, I'd read to Max, then sleep. The house was still, the TV off, and I stretched. My warehouse job started early, but I had time. Sarah said, "I'll tuck him in," and I nodded, "Thanks." The living room was dark, the toys neat, and I sat with my soda. The kitchen was clean, her voice low, and I felt normal. The truck waited, the night quiet, and I stayed home. The house was mine, our life steady, and I looked forward to rest. After dinner, I sat with Max in the living room, ready to play. The house was quiet, the TV off, and I pulled out paper and crayons. He grabbed a blue one, drawing a car, and I started on a house. The kitchen was still, Sarah cleaning up, and I felt relaxed. My warehouse job was done. Tom handled the night shift, and I enjoyed this. The living room was warm, his laughter soft, and I said, "Let's make something cool." He nodded, "Okay," and we worked together. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I stayed with him. I asked about his day. I said, "So how was your day?" And he kept drawing. "Good." The house was cozy, the fridge humming, and I added a treat in my sketch. Sarah yelled, "Need help?" And I said, "No, we're good." Max pushed his car drawing closer, and I smiled. My warehouse job paid the bills. But this was my time. The living room had his toys scattered, and I asked, "Anything fun happen?" He nodded. "Yeah, yesterday was funny." The truck waited the night early, and I listened. He mentioned something odd. He said, "Uncle Josh hid in the closet," and Mom laughed. I froze, crayon in hand, and said, "What?" The house felt still, his words hanging, and I looked at him. The kitchen clanked with dishes, Sarah busy, and I asked, "Who's Josh?" Max shrugged, "Just a guy," and kept drawing. My warehouse job faded, Tom texted, "All clear," and I ignored it. The living room was warm, his innocence clear, and I felt a twist. The truck sat outside, the driveway quiet, and I stayed calm. The house was normal, but my mind raced. I pressed a little. I said, "When was this?" And he said, "Yesterday when you were gone." The house was silent, the fridge humming, and I thought back. 2 days ago, I was on a work trip. The kitchen was busy, Sarah's voice low, and I nodded. "Oh." Max added wheels to his car, and I sketched a roof. My warehouse job was steady. But this bothered me. The living room had his drawings, bright colors, and I asked, "What else?" He said, "Mom was happy." The truck waited, the night calm, and I felt uneasy. I kept it light. I said, "Sound like fun," and he laughed. "Yeah, Josh was silly." The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I drew a window. Sarah came in, "Dinner's done," and I said, "Great." Standing up, my warehouse job was over, Tom managed, and I put the crayons away. The living room was messy, his toys everywhere, and I ruffled his hair. The kitchen smelled good, her smile normal, and I stayed quiet. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I thought about Josh. The house was ours, but something felt off. I thought about the trip. 2 days ago, I was at the warehouse, handling a big order, and stayed late. The house was empty, Sarah alone with Max, and I called her. The living room was far, my mind on work, and she said, "All good here." My warehouse job kept me busy, but I trusted her. The kitchen was quiet then, the fridge humming, and I felt fine. The truck rumbled home, the road dark, and I arrived late. The house was normal, her routine set, and I didn't suspect anything. The yard was still, the past clear, and I stayed calm. I watched Max play. He built a tower with blocks, and I helped, stacking one on top. The house was cozy, his focus tight, and I said, "Good job." Sarah yelled, "Dessert?" And I said, "Yes." My warehouse job faded, Tom covered, and I enjoyed this. The living room was bright, his laugh loud, and I thought of Josh. The kitchen clanked with plates, her voice steady, and I stayed quiet. The truck sat outside, the night early, and I felt a question. The house was home, our life normal, but his words stuck with me. I decided to listen. After dessert, I sat with Max again, drawing more. The house was warm, the TV on low, and I said, "Tell me about Josh." He said, "He's tall," and kept coloring. My warehouse job was done. Tom handled the late shift, and I nodded, "Okay." The living room had his toys, bright and messy, and I asked, "What else?" He said, "Mom likes him." The kitchen was quiet, Sarah out of sight, and I felt a chill. The truck waited, the driveway still, and I stayed calm. The house was ours, but my mind turned to Josh. I planned my next move. That night, I tucked Max in, reading a book, and he fell asleep. The house was still, the lights dim, and I stepped out. My warehouse job started early, but I had time. Sarah was in the kitchen cleaning, and I said, "Good night." The living room was dark, the toys neat, and I sat with the water. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I thought about yesterday. The house was normal, her routine set, but Josh's name lingered. The yard was still, the past shifting, and I decided to dig deeper. I woke up the next day. Josh's name stuck in my head. The house was quiet, the morning light come to the window, and I got out of bed. Sarah was still asleep, her breathing steady, and I tiptoed to the kitchen. My warehouse job started soon, but I lingered, making coffee. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and I thought about Max. The living room was dark, his toys neat, and I sat with my mug. The truck waited outside, the driveway still, and I decided to ask him more. The house felt normal, but my mind was uneasy. I found Max playing. After breakfast, I went to the living room where he was building with blocks. The house was warm, the TV off, and I sat with him. Sarah was in the shower, water running, and I said, "Hey, want to build a castle?" He nodded, "Yeah," and handed me a block. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I stayed. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I stacked a wall. The living room was bright, his focus tight, and I felt close to him. The truck sat outside, the road empty, and I prepared to talk. I asked softly. I said, "Who's Josh?" My voice gentle, and he kept building, "A friend." The house was still, the fridge humming, and I added a tower. Sarah's shower stopped, her footsteps light, and I said, "When did he come?" Max shrugged. "When you're not here." My warehouse job faded. Tom texted, "Shift starts." And I ignored it. The living room was cozy, his innocence clear, and he says, "Mom's pretty." The truck waited, the driveway quiet, and I felt a chill. The house was ours, but my suspicion grew. I kept it easy. I said, "Oh, that's nice." And he laughed. "Yeah, he's funny." The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I added a roof. Sarah came in, "Breakfast ready?" And I said, "Yeah." Standing up, my warehouse job was busy, but I stayed focused. The toolbox sat home, the wrench in use, and I ruffled his hair. The living room was messy, blocks everywhere, and I said, "Let's play later." The truck sat outside, the morning calm, and I stayed calm. The house felt normal, her smile routine, but Josh lingered. I thought about his words. "Mom's pretty," and "when you're not here" stuck with me. The house was quiet, the fridge humming, and I sat with my coffee. My warehouse job paid the bills, but this bothered me. The living room had his drawings, bright colors, and I remember my trip. The kitchen was clean, Sarah busy, and I thought of her laugh with Josh. The truck waited, the road still, and I felt uneasy. The toolbox sat home, the sink dry, and I decided not to push Max. The house was ours, but my mind turned to her. I watched her move. Sarah cooked lunch, humming, and I helped with plates. The house smelled good, the table set, and Max ran in. My warehouse job was done, Tom managed, and I stayed home. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and she said, "Long day?" I nodded, "Yeah." The living room was quiet, the blocks neat, and I served Max. The kitchen was warm, her voice steady, and I stayed quiet. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I thought of Josh. The house was normal, but my suspicion grew. I played with Max again. After lunch, we drew, and I said, "Tell me more about Josh." The house was cozy, his crayon moving, and he said, "He brings candy." My warehouse job faded, Tom covered, and I nodded, "Oh." The living room was bright, his focus on a dog, and I sketched a tree. The kitchen clanked with dishes, Sarah out of sight, and I asked, "When?" He said, "Last week." The truck waited, the road quiet, and I felt a twist. The house was ours, but Josh's visits bothered me. I kept it light. I said, "Sounds fun," and he smiled. "Yeah, Mom likes him." The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I drew a sun. Sarah yelled, "Need help?" And I said, "No, staying with Max." My warehouse job was over. Tom handled the night, and I enjoyed this. The living room was messy, paper everywhere. I put the crayons away. The kitchen was busy, her voice low, and I stayed calm. The truck sat outside, the morning gone, and I thought of Josh. The house felt off, my mind racing, and I planned to watch her. I talked to Tom. That evening, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, "Something's up with Sarah." He nodded, heard that before. I asked, "Think it's bad?" And he said, "Maybe." The house waited, her routine set, and I worked late. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, but my mind was on Josh. The toolbox sat home, the sink quiet, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road dark, and I parked. The house was still, her smile fake, and I stayed ready. The living room was quiet, the past shifting, and I prepared to dig. I couldn't shake Josh's name after talking to Max. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, thinking it over. The house was quiet, Sarah still asleep, and I stared at the wall. My warehouse job started soon, but I stayed put, the truck parked. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and my mind raced. The living room was dark, his toys neat, and I thought about his words. "When you're not here." The yard was still, the driveway empty, and I felt a growing doubt. The house was ours, but something was wrong. I thought about the timing. 2 days ago, I was on a work trip, handling a big order at the warehouse. The house was empty, Sarah alone with Max, and I called her. The kitchen was quiet then, her voice normal, and she said, "Oh, good." My warehouse job kept me busy, but now I wondered. The living room had his drawings, bright colors, and I remembered her laugh. The truck rumbled home late, the road dark, and I arrived tired. The toolbox waited, the sink dry, and I felt uneasy. The house was normal, but Josh's visit bothered me. I decided to dig. That afternoon, I checked my phone, scrolling through old texts with Sarah. The house was warm, the fridge humming, and I found nothing odd. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed help, but I stayed home. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench unused, and I looked at her social media. The living room was quiet, the TV off, and I saw no Josh. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I checked call logs. The kitchen was clean, her routine set, and I saw a number I didn't know. The yard was empty, my suspicion growing, and I saved it. I thought about her story. She said she stayed home during my trip, watching Max. The house was still, the clock ticking, and I replayed it. My warehouse job was steady, but her laugh with Josh stuck. The living room had our couch picked together, and I sat on it. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I remembered her all good call. The truck waited, the road quiet, and I felt a twist. The kitchen smelled of last night's soup, her voice in my head, and I doubted her. The yard was neat, the past shifting, and I planned to watch her. I talked to Tom. That evening, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, "Sarah's hiding something." He nodded, figured something was off. I asked, "Think it's bad?" And he said, "Could be." The house waited, her routine normal, and I worked late. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, but my mind was on Josh. The toolbox sat home, the sink dry, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road dark, and I parked. The living room was still, her smile fake, and I stayed ready. The yard was quiet, the past unclear, and I prepared to check. I looked at photos. The next day, I scrolled through our pictures, looking for clues. The house was warm, the fridge humming, and I saw no Josh. My warehouse job was busy, Tom managed, and I stayed home. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I checked dates. The living room had Max's art, bright colors, and I thought of his words. The truck sat outside, the driveway still, and I found a gap, my trip day. The kitchen was clean, her voice low, and I felt a hunch. The yard was empty, my suspicion firm, and I decided to track her. I checked her movements. That afternoon, I looked at her phone when she showered. Seeing a text, "See you soon." The house was quiet, the water running, and I saved it. My warehouse job faded, Tom covered, and I stayed alert. The toolbox sat home, the sink quiet, and I noted the time. The living room was dark, the toys neat, and I heard her come out. The truck waited, the road still, and I put the phone back. The kitchen was warm, her smile normal, and I felt a lead. The yard was still, the past shifting, and I planned to follow. I thought about Max. He said Josh brought candy, and I wonder how often. The house was cozy, the clock ticking, and I sat with soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this distracted me. The toolbox waited, the wrench unused, and I remembered his laugh. The living room had our couch, picked by me, and I doubted her. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I thought of her lie. The kitchen smelled of coffee, her routine set, and I stayed calm. The yard was neat, my mindset, and I prepared to act. I set a plan. That evening, I decided to check her story next time I'm out. The house was still, the lights dim, and I sat with my phone. My warehouse job started early, but I had time. Sarah said, "Long day?" And I nodded, "Yeah." The living room was quiet, the toys put away, and I stayed alert. The toolbox sat home, the sink dry, and I saved a number. The truck waited, the road dark, and I thought of Josh. The kitchen was clean, her voice low, and I felt ready. The yard was empty, the past unclear, and I prepared to prove it. I decided to test Sarah's story after finding that text. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, thinking about "See you soon." The house was quiet, Max playing in the living room, and I stayed calm. My warehouse job started soon, but I lingered. The truck parked. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and I planned my move. The living room was warm, his toys scattered, and I heard him laugh. The yard was still, the driveway empty, and I felt ready to check her. The house was ours, but my suspicion grew. I asked about her day. That afternoon, I said, "How was yesterday?" as she cooked. The house smelled of soup, the kitchen busy, and she said, "Fine. Stayed home with Max." My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I stayed home. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I nodded, "Oh, good." The living room was quiet, Max drawing, and I watched her. The truck sat outside, the road still, and she smiled. Just a normal day. The yard was neat, her lie possible, and I felt a twist. The house was warm, but I wasn't sure. I pressed a bit. I said, "Did you go out?" And she paused, stirring the pot. The house was still, the fridge humming, and she said, "No, just with a friend later." My warehouse job faded. Tom texted, "Shift okay," and I ignored it. The toolbox sat home, the wrench unused, and I asked, "Who?" She laughed. "Just Lisa, you know her." The living room was bright, Max's crayons moving, and I nodded, "Right." The truck waited, the driveway quiet, and I noticed her hands shake. The yard was empty, my doubt firm, and I stayed calm. I checked her phone. That evening, she showered, and I grabbed her phone from the table. The house was quiet, water running, and I saw the text again. "See you soon," from an unknown number. My warehouse job was done, Tom managed, and I saved it. The toolbox sat home, the sink dry, and I looked at call logs. The living room was dark, Max asleep, and I found a call matching my trip. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I put it back. The kitchen was warm, her routine set, and I felt proof. The yard was still, my plan clear, and I stayed alert. I thought about the lie. She said she was with Lisa, but the text didn't fit. The house was cozy, the clock ticking, and I sat with a soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this distracted me. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I remembered her pause. The living room had our couch, picked together, and I doubted her. The truck waited, the road quiet, and I thought of Josh. The kitchen smelled of soap, her voice low, and I felt a lead. The yard was neat, my mind set, and I prepared to ask again. I talked to Tom. The next day, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, "Sarah's lying about something." He nodded, "Check it out." I asked, "Think it's Josh?" And he said, "Maybe." The house waited, her story weak, and I worked late. My warehouse job held. Paycheck's good, but my focus was her. The toolbox sat home, the sink quiet, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road dark, and I parked. The living room was still, her smile fake, and I stayed ready. The yard was empty, the past shifting, and I planned to catch her. I set a trap. That afternoon, I said, "I'm working late tomorrow," watching her. The house was warm, the fridge humming, and she said, "Okay, I'll manage." My warehouse job was busy, Tom covered, and I nodded, "Good." The toolbox waited, the wrench unused, and I noted her tone. The living room was quiet, Max playing, and I stayed calm. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I planned to stay home. The kitchen was clean, her smile normal, and I felt a hunch. The yard was still, my moves set, and I prepared to follow. I checked her moves. The next day, I pretended to leave, the truck rumbling away, and parked down the street. The house was out of sight, the road quiet, and I waited. My warehouse job was off. Tom handled it, and I watched. The toolbox stayed home, the sink dry, and I saw her leave with Max. The living room was far, her lie clear, and I followed. The truck hummed, the engine low, and I kept distance. The kitchen was gone, her story false, and I felt proof. The yard was behind, my suspicion confirmed, and I stayed alert. I saw her stop. She pulled up to a house, Max in tow, and a man met them, tall like Max said. The house was unfamiliar, lights on, and I parked, hiding. My warehouse job faded, Tom managed, and I watched. The toolbox was home, the wrench still, and I saw her hug him. The living room was gone, her lie exposed, and I took a photo. The truck sat still, the road dark, and I felt sick. The kitchen was far, her smile fake, and I knew it was Josh. The yard was behind, my proof set, and I prepared to act. I had the photo of Sarah with Josh, and I knew it was time to talk. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, the picture on my phone. The house was quiet, Max playing in the living room, and I felt ready. My warehouse job started soon, but I stayed home, the truck parked. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and I planned my words. The living room was warm, his toys scattered, and I heard him laugh. The yard was still, the driveway empty, and I waited for her. The house was ours, but the truth was close. She came in. That afternoon, Sarah walked into the kitchen, humming, and started cooking. The house smelled of onions, the stove on, and I stood up. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I ignored it. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I said, "We need to talk." She turned, "About what?" And I stayed calm. The living room was quiet, Max drawing, and I held my phone. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I felt firm. The yard was neat, the moment set, and I prepared to ask. I brought up Josh. I said, "Who's Josh, and why did Max say he was here?" The house went still, the fridge humming, and she laughed. "What?" My warehouse job faded. Tom texted, "Shift okay," and I showed the photo. The toolbox sat home, the wrench unused, and she froze. The living room was bright, Max's crayons moving, and I said, "He saw him." The truck waited, the driveway quiet, and she said, "You believe a kid's story?" The yard was empty, her lie weak, and I stayed calm. She dodged it. She said, "Max makes things up," her voice shaky, and I nodded, "Maybe." The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I showed the text, "See you soon." My warehouse job was done, Tom managed, and I stayed firm. The toolbox waited, the sink dry, and she said, "That's nothing." The living room was quiet, Max focused, and I asked, "Then who's this guy?" The truck sat outside, the road still, and she looked away. The yard was still, my proof clear, and I felt her nervousness. I pressed on. I said, "Max said Josh calls you pretty." And she laughed again. "Kids say weird stuff." The house was cozy, the stove simmering, and I held the phone up. My warehouse job held. Paycheck steady. But I focused here. The toolbox at home, the wrench still, and I said, I saw you with him. The living room was warm. Max's laugh soft, and she paused. The truck waited, the driveway empty, and she said, It's not what you think. The yard was neat, her excuse then, and I stayed quiet. I thought about the evidence. The photo showed her hugging Josh, Mac beside her, and I knew it was real. The house was still, the fridge humming, and I sat with my soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this mattered more. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I remembered her lie. The living room had our couch picked together, and I doubted her. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I thought of Max's words. The kitchen smelled of soup, her voice low, and I felt done. The yard was empty, my mind set, and I stayed calm. I watched her reaction. She stirred the pot, avoiding my eyes, and I stood by the table. The house was warm, the clock ticking, and she said, Let's eat. My warehouse job was over, Tom covered, and I shook my head. Not yet. The toolbox sat home, the wrench unused, and I waited. The living room was bright, Max drawing, and she turned off the stove. The truck sat outside, the road still, and she said, You're overreacting. The yard was still, my proof strong, and I prepared to push. I talked to Tom. That evening, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, I confronted her about Josh. He nodded. What did she say? I said, denied it, and he frowned, check more. The house waited, her lie clear, and I worked late. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, but my mind was on her. The toolbox at home, the sink dry, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road dark, and I parked. The living room was quiet, her smile gone, and I stayed ready. The yard was empty, the past shifting, and I planned my next step. I set a boundary. That night, I said, I need the truth, and she sighed. There's nothing to tell. The house was still, the lights dim, and I sat with my water. My warehouse job started early, but I had time. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I said, Max isn't lying. The living room was dark, the toys neat, and she walked away. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I felt resolve. The kitchen was clean, her back turned, and I stayed calm. The yard was still, my decision firm, and I prepared to act. Max's words about Josh stuck with me after our talk. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, thinking it over. The house was quiet, Sarah getting ready, and I felt determined. My warehouse job started soon, but I stayed home, the truck parked. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and I planned my next move. The living room was warm, Max playing with toys, and I heard him laugh. The yard was still, the driveway empty, and I waited for more. The house was ours, but the truth was near. He said something new. That afternoon, I sat with Max in the living room, drawing again. The house was cozy, the TV off, and he said, Mom told Josh she loves him. I stopped, crayon in hand, and said, What? The kitchen was quiet, Sarah out, and he nodded, Yeah, yesterday. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I stayed. The toolbox waited, the sink dry, and I asked, When? He shrugged. When you were working. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I felt a chill. The yard was neat, my suspicion confirmed, and I stayed calm. I knew it was real. Loves him wasn't a kid's game, and I thought of the photo. The house was still, the fridge humming, and I put the crayons away. My warehouse job faded. Tom texted, Shift okay, and I ignored it. The toolbox sat home, the wrench unused, and I remembered her lie. The living room had our couch picked together, and I sat on it. The truck waited, the driveway quiet, and I decided to act. The kitchen was clean, her voice gone, and I felt proof. The yard was empty, my mind set, and I planned to record it. I bought a recorder. That evening, I drove to the store, the truck rumbling, and picked up a small device. The house waited, Sarah at work, and I paid cash. My warehouse job was done, Tom managed, and I drove back. The toolbox sat home, the sink quiet, and I tested it in the kitchen. The living room was dark, Max asleep, and I hid it by the phone. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I felt ready. The yard was still, my plan set, and I waited for a call. The house was mine, the truth close, and I stayed alert. I set it up. The next day, I said, I'm working late, and she nodded, okay. The house was warm, the fridge humming, and I left, the truck rumbling away. My warehouse job was off, Tom covered, and I parked down the street. The toolbox stayed home, the wrench still, and I watched. The living room was far, her lie in play, and I waited. The truck hummed, the engine low, and I saw her on the phone. The kitchen was out of sight, her voice faint, and I knew the recorder was on. The yard was behind, my proof coming, and I stayed calm. I heard it later. That night, I came home, the truck quiet, and checked the recorder. The house was still, Sarah asleep, and I listened. My warehouse job faded. Tom handled it, and I heard her say, "Love you, Josh. See you tomorrow." The toolbox sat home, the sink dry, and I saved the file. The living room was dark, Max sleeping, and I felt sick. The truck waited, the road still, and I had the proof. The kitchen was quiet, her lie clear, and I knew it was over. The yard was empty, my decision firm, and I stayed calm. I thought about Max. He didn't know what he'd done, just a kid telling the truth. The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I sat with a soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this hurt. The toolbox waited, the wrench unused, and I remembered his laugh. The living room had his toys, bright colors, and I felt for him. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I thought of her words. The kitchen smelled of last night's soup, her voice recorded, and I stayed firm. The yard was neat, my proof solid, and I prepared to end it. I talked to Tom. The next morning, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, "I got her on tape." He nodded. "That's it." I asked, "What now?" And he said, "Confront her." The house waited, her lie exposed, and I worked late. My warehouse job held. Paycheck's good, but my mind was set. The toolbox sat home, the sink quiet, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road dark, and I parked. The living room was still, her smile gone, and I stayed ready. The yard was empty, the past shifting, and I planned my move. I prepared to act. That afternoon, I saved the recording, the file secure, and sat with my phone. The house was quiet, the fridge humming, and I waited for her. My warehouse job was busy. Tom managed. And I stayed home. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I felt resolve. The living room was warm, Max playing, and I kept it hidden. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I thought of Josh. The kitchen was clean, her return near, and I stayed calm. The yard was still, my proof ready, and I prepared to confront her. I had the recording of Sarah with Josh, and it was time to confront her. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, the file ready. The house was quiet, Max playing in the living room, and I felt steady. My warehouse job started soon, but I stayed home. The truck parked. The toolbox sat on the counter, the wrench still, and I planned my words. The living room was warm, his toys scattered, and I heard him laugh. The yard was still, the driveway empty, and I waited for her. The house was ours, but the end was near. She came home. That afternoon, Sarah walked in, her bag on the floor, and said, "Long day." The house smelled of stale air, the kitchen empty, and I stood up. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I ignored it. The toolbox waited, the sink quiet, and I said, "We need to talk." She looked at me. "About what?" And I stayed calm. The living room was quiet, Max drawing, and I held my phone. The truck sat outside, the road still, and I felt firm. The yard was neat, the moment set, and I prepared to show her. I played the recording. I said, "Listen to this," and hit play, her voice saying, "Love you, Josh. See you tomorrow." The house went still, the fridge humming, and she froze. My warehouse job faded. Tom texted, "Shift okay," and I watched her. The toolbox sat home, the wrench unused, and she said, "Where'd you get that?" The living room was bright, Max's crayons moving, and I said, "I recorded it." The truck waited, the driveway quiet, and she turned pale. The yard was empty, my proof clear, and I stayed calm. She tried to deny it. She said, "It's not what it sounds like," her voice shaky, and I shook my head. "It is." The house was warm, the clock ticking, and I showed the photo. My warehouse job was done. Tom managed, and I stayed firm. The toolbox waited, the sink dry, and she said, "That's just a friend." The living room was quiet, Max focused, and I said, "Max saw you." The truck sat outside, the road still, and she looked away. The yard was still, her lie broken, and I felt done. I laid it out. I said, "Josh is your lover. He's been here when I'm gone." The house was cozy, the stove off, and she stepped back. My warehouse job held. Paycheck steady, but I focused here. The toolbox sat home, the wrench still, and I played the file again. The living room was warm, Max's laugh soft, and she said, "I can explain." The truck waited, the driveway empty, and I said, "No need." The yard was neat, my evidence solid, and I stayed quiet. The kitchen was clean, her act over, and I prepared to leave. I thought about Max. He didn't know the mess, just a kid telling truth. The house was still, the fridge humming, and I sat with a soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this hurt. The toolbox waited, the wrench unused, and I remembered his words. The living room had his toys, bright colors, and I felt for him. The truck sat outside, the road quiet, and I thought her betrayal. The kitchen smelled of nothing, her voice recorded, and I stayed firm. The yard was empty, my proof set, and I planned to go. I packed my things. That evening, I grabbed a bag, stuffing clothes and tools. The house was warm, the lights dim, and Sarah watched. My warehouse job was over, Tom covered, and I stayed focused. The toolbox at home, the wrench packed, and I took my phone. The living room was quiet, Max asleep, and I left couch. The truck waited, the road dark, and she said, "Don't go." The yard was still, my decision firm, and I ignored her. The kitchen was empty, her lie exposed, and I headed out. I talked to Tom. The next morning, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, "I caught her with Josh." He nodded, "Tough break." I asked, "What now?" And he said, "Move on." The house waited, her voice gone, and I worked late. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, but my mind was clear. The toolbox was with me. The sink gone, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road quiet, and I parked nearby. The living room was far, her smile fake, and I stayed ready. The yard was behind, the past over, and I planned ahead. I set my terms. That afternoon I said, "I'm done, you keep the house." The house was still, the fridge humming, and she cried, "Please." My warehouse job was busy. Tom managed, and I shook my head. The toolbox sat in my truck, the wrench mine, and I left a key. The living room was warm, Max playing, and I hugged him. The truck waited, the road ready, and I said, "Take care." The yard was empty, my exit set, and I drove off. The kitchen was hers, her life finished, and I felt free. I left the house with my bag, but Sarah's call started soon after. That morning, I sat in the truck, parked nearby, and my phone buzzed. The house was out of sight, her voice on voicemail, "Come back." I turned it off, the yard fading, and felt firm. My warehouse job started soon, but I stayed put, the toolbox beside me. The wrench sat in the bag, and used, and I thought it over. The living room was gone, Max's laugh of memory, and I stayed calm. The road was quiet, my decision set, and I knew it was over. The truck hummed, my new start near, and I waited. She kept trying. That afternoon she texted, "Let's talk," and called again, "Please don't do this." The house was far, the kitchen empty, and I ignored it. My warehouse job loomed. Tom needed me, but I stayed out. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and she left another message. "It's a mistake." I deleted it, the photo safe. The living room was a blur, her lie exposed, and I felt done. The road was still, the truck steady, and I drove to a motel. The yard was behind, her pleas weak, and I checked in. The room was plain, my mind clear, and I stayed calm. She showed up. The next day, she knocked on the motel door, bag in hand, and said, "We can fix this." The room was small, the bed unmade, and I shook my head. My warehouse job was busy, Tom managed, and I stayed firm. The toolbox sat by the door, the wrench packed, and I said, "No." The living room was gone, Max's toys far, and she cried, "I love you." The road was quiet, the truck parked, and I showed a recording. The yard was out of reach, her act broken, and I stayed quiet. The room was still, my proof strong, and I prepared to end it. I told her off. I said, "I know about Josh, the calls, the visits," and she froze. The room was warm, the air stale, and I played the file again. My warehouse job faded, Tom covered, and I stayed steady. The toolbox waited, the wrench mine, and she said, "It's not like that." The living room was a memory, her lie clear, and I said, "Max told me." The road was still, the truck ready, and she yelled, "You spied on me." The yard was gone, my evidence solid, and I nodded. I had to. The room was quiet, her excuse thin, and I felt free. I set my terms. I said, "I'm done, you keep the house, but I'm out." The room was plain, the bed creaking, and she sank to a chair. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, but I focused here. The toolbox sat by the door, the wrench still, and I said, "No contact." The living room was far, Max's laugh faint, and she begged, "What about him?" The road was quiet, the truck waiting, and I said, "He's better off." The yard was behind, my exit firm, and I stayed calm. The room was still, her tears falling, and I prepared to leave. I thought about Max. He didn't deserve this, just a kid caught in her mess. The room was warm, the clock ticking, and I sat with a soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this hurt. The toolbox waited, the wrench packed, and I remembered his smile. The living room had his toys, bright colors, and I felt for him. The road was dark, the truck ready, and I thought of her betrayal. The yard was gone, her voice recorded, and I stayed firm. The room was mine, my decision set, and I planned ahead. I packed more. That evening, I grabbed my tools, the bag full, and checked out. The room was empty, the bed stripped, and I drove off. My warehouse job was done. Tom managed, and I found a new place. The toolbox sat in the truck, the wrench secure, and I unloaded it. The living room was a new space, plain walls, and I set up. The road was quiet, the past behind, and she called again. The yard was gone, her pleas ignored, and I blocked her. The truck waited, my start fresh, and I stayed calm. I talked to Tom. The next morning, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and said, I told her it's over. He nodded. Good move. I asked, what now? And he said, focus on work. The house was far, her lie done, and I worked late. My warehouse job held. Profits up, and I stayed busy. The toolbox was with me. The sink gone, and I drove back. The truck rumbled, the road still, and I parked. The living room was mine, her voice gone, and I stayed ready. The yard was a memory, the past over, and I moved on. I felt the change. That afternoon, I sat in my new place. The room quiet. The house was behind, the fridge humming, and I unpacked. My warehouse job was solid, Tom covered, and I set up a desk. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I felt free. The living room was bare, my space now, and I thought of trust. The road was dark. The truck parked, and I knew the truth. The yard was gone, the betrayal done, and I stayed cool. The room was mine, my decision firm, and I looked ahead. Sarah stopped calling after I blocked her, and my new place felt right. That morning, I woke up in a small apartment, the sun coming to the window, and made coffee. The room was quiet, no echoes of her, and I felt free. My warehouse job started soon, but I lingered, the truck parked. The toolbox sat by the door, the wrench still, and I unpacked more. The living room was bare, my space now, and I heard no noise. The road was still, the past gone, and I started fresh. The yard was a memory, my lesson clear, and I stayed calm. I got back to work. That afternoon, I drove to the warehouse, unloading boxes, and Tom said, settled in? I nodded. Yeah. The room was far, the truck steady, and I worked late. My warehouse job held, paychecks good, and I balanced books. The toolbox waited, the wrench packed, and I talked to customers. The living room was mine, plain walls, and I felt solid. The road was quiet, the truck parked, and I earned more. The yard was gone, her betrayal over, and I stayed focused. The apartment was home, my routine set, and I moved on. I thought about Max. He was innocent, just a kid telling the truth, and I missed him. The room was warm, the fridge humming, and I sat with a soda. My warehouse job thrived, orders rolling in, but this hurt. The toolbox sat by the door, the wrench still, and I remembered his laugh. The living room had no toys, just my chair, and I felt for him. The road was dark, the truck ready, and I hope he'd be okay. The yard was behind, her lie exposed, and I stayed firm. The apartment was mine, my heart heavy, and I learned something. I reflected on a lesson. Her words, Josh's visits, all came from Max's honesty. The room was quiet, the clock ticking, and I unpacked boxes. My warehouse job was solid, Tom managed, and I saw the pattern. The toolbox waited, the wrench used, and I realized quiet moves beat loud fights. The living room was bare, my space clean, and I thought of trust. The road was still, the truck parked, and I knew the truth wins. The yard was gone, the past done, and I felt wiser. The apartment was home, my start new, and I stayed calm. I built a life. The next day, I bought a table, setting it up in the room. The apartment was warm, the windows open, and I cooked dinner. My warehouse job was busy, Tom covered, and I ate alone. The toolbox sat by the wall, the wrench secure, and I planned upgrades. The living room was mine, the table new, and I felt in control. The road was quiet, the truck waiting, and I saved money. The yard was a memory, her voice gone, and I stayed steady. The apartment was home, my future set, and I looked ahead. I talked to Tom more. That evening, I drove to the warehouse, unloading late, and said, I'm good now. He nodded, tough but smart. I asked, any advice? And he said, keep moving. The room waited. Her call stopped, and I worked hard. My warehouse job held, profits up, and I drove back. The toolbox was with me, the sink gone, and I parked. The living room was still, my chair comfy, and I felt ready. The road was dark, the truck quiet, and I stayed cool. The yard was behind, the past over, and I planned growth. I checked the silence. The next morning, no texts, no knocks, and I walked the room. The apartment was clean, her trace gone, and I threw out old papers. My warehouse job was solid, Tom managed, and I set up a lamp. The toolbox waited, the wrench still, and I felt a new start. The living room was bright, my space mine, and I unpacked more. The road was still, the truck parked, and I stayed calm. The yard was a memory, the betrayal done, and I saved a recording. The apartment was home, my piece set, and I moved on. I felt the change. That afternoon, I sat with a sandwich. The room quiet. The apartment was mine, the fridge humming, and I worked on orders. My warehouse job thrived, customers loyal, and I planned a raise. The toolbox sat by the wall, the wrench secure, and I felt free. The living room was bare, my chair new, and I thought of trust. The road was dark, the truck ready, and I knew the truth. The yard was gone, the lesson learned, and I stayed cool. The apartment was home, my life mine, and I looked forward,